Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of Ken Sweeney, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love and poetry, and also his life in music with the band Brian, who released 2 albums in the 90s, Understand and Bring Trouble, and is going to be having the debut album reissued very soon, in fact the summer of 2025, on Needle Mythology Records, which I do believe is going to feature a few extra tracks. So anyway, this is the interview with Ken, who's going to tell us everything about life and much more, and obviously his early musical influences. Ken, it's over to you.
I grew up 4 brothers, in Dublin, just beside the Phoenix Park in Dublin. My eldest brother, David Sweeney, was a musician, and he was in bands from very early on. He played guitar, and his first band were called the Max Quad Band, and they were from the Navan Road in Dublin. And Adam Clayton of U2 played bass with the Max Quad Band. He joined them for maybe a year, and they got rid of him, and he went back to U2. So one of my first memories is opening the door to this guy with this amazing blonde hair, and he somehow thought that my brother Dave was called Max, because that was my brother's nickname, Max, because he was in the Max Quad Band. And he said, "Is Max in?" And I said, "I don't know who Max is. Who's Max?" And I think my brother came to the door. So I saw my brother playing in bands, and he played in, Rocky De Valera and the Gravediggers. And then he played in a band called the Vipers, which will be about 1978. The Vipers were a big kind of punk band in Ireland, and the Jam came to Ireland to do an Irish tour in 1978, and the Vipers were a bit kind of punk mod, and they supported them, and they supported them on 2 dates in Ireland. And Jesus, like the NME actually wrote about the tour, and they describe Paul Weller teaching my brother how to play Tattoo by The Who on guitar backstage, and like So I was, at that stage, I would have been about 11 or 12. And I remember going into my brother's room, and he had the Jam single Down in the Tube Station at Midnight. And I remember playing that and thinking it was just amazing, So he went off, he was studying law, and he scandalised the family by dropping out of UCD, where he was studying law, and going off to London with this band, the Vipers. And they toured with the Boomtown Rats around the time of Rat Trap, was the number 1. And then Dave came back to Dublin that Christmas, and he with all that rock and roll, like he just seemed like he was coming from another planet. So I suppose that spurred me on to kind of play guitar. And being brothers, we sing really good harmonies. So one of my first memories is myself and my brother Dave, singing things like singing Jam songs and singing Squeeze songs. We sang a lot of Squeeze songs and stuff. And so Dave later on, he was also in this band, The Fat Lady Sings. He played on there. He was with them at the start. He went to London with them again. And I was kind of doing music. And I started because my brother had got me into the Jam, I was a mod, I suppose, at about, which might seem a bit crazy to some people. I was a mod at about, let's say, 15 or 16. I was into the mod thing. And of course, that's great because it gets you into The Who and all these really, the action, the creation, and all these really original 60s bands. And that's what I was into. And myself and a couple of my friends, we started a mod band called Instant Party, which is named after a Who song. It's if you know the Who song, it's called Circles. And there was a big, mod contingent in Dublin at the time, and we played lots of gigs. And it was more like the Moondogs. It was more like a new wave kind of power pop band, and I wrote songs in that as well. We played gigs, and then I kind of dropped out of it for a while. I was going out with my girlfriend at the time, and what happened then was my brother had left the Fat Lady Sings, and he was recording some solo stuff in a studio in Dublin, and he kind of just disappeared one day, and I was just left in the studio on my own with the engineer he was using. And I said to the engineer, can I record one of my own songs? And he was just bored, the engineer, and he said, yeah. So I just kind of went in, rushed in, and I had this song, A Million Miles, which, I'd had at the time. and I played it. I played all the bits of it, and your man stuck it on a cassette for me, and I kind of forgot about it. And what happened was I had two friends at the time, Niall Austin and Graham Linehan, and I gave them a cassette of some band. It might have been the Go-Betweens, or it might have been the Replacements, or somebody. And at the end, I'd forgotten that I had put this track, I think on the day the guy was giving me a copy of the song I'd recorded, I put it on the only cassette I had in the car, and it was this Replacements album. So they were listening to this Replacements album, and then I suddenly arrived on the cassette singing this song, A Million Miles Away, A Million Miles, and they loved it. And, so Niall Austin, who was my friend, he said, listen, we should rehearse. Have you got any other songs? So Good Friday, I think it might have been, let's say, Good Friday, I think it was maybe, could it be 87 or 88? We had a rehearsal. Good Friday is a day in Ireland where everything closes down. And me and Niall had a rehearsal, me playing guitar and him doing keyboards. And we realised that I suppose that gave me confidence a bit, David. That they liked my song, and that there was something in it. And we recorded this song. I was moving to London around that stage, and I went to London on my own. But just before I left, I recorded this song, A Million Miles, and we put it out in Ireland on our own label. I went to London. I disappeared off to London, like a lot of Irish people did at the time. And I came back at Christmas, and in the critics poll in Hot Press, which was the music magazine, A Million Miles was like the 4th best single of the year. And I just thought that was meant. The fact that it wasn't even a band, and that kind of started the whole kind of Brian thing going, really.
Yes, well, that's amazing. So when you got to that ripe age of 16, did you leave school at that point? Because this would have been, was that about 86, 87 that you hit 16?
No, I think I left school in the mid 80s, and I bizarrely enough, I would have studied computers. I don't know why. It's just something to do. Didn't really know what I wanted to do. There's a big emphasis in Ireland on the Irish language and maths, and I was terrible at those things. I grew up on the BBC, and I grew up on, I read a lot of newspapers. I wasn't any good at the Irish language, which at the time prevented you from going to university or really doing anything meaningful. So I ended up going into computers, and then I was working in an ad agency, and I was studying copywriting at night, but I was doing projection film in this ad agency. It was a big ad agency in Ireland, and it was very intense, and it was... In fact, I wrote a song, We Close 1 to 2, later on, about we used to close the projection department between 1 and 2 and just rest. But when I went to London, that paid off, because a big album for me around that time was Micro Disney's The Clock Comes Down the Stairs. Because at the time in Ireland, in the mid-80s, unless your father had a business, you were finished. Unless you were going to university or your father had a business you could go into, there were no jobs, absolutely nothing. There was schemes and false things they put you on to kill a bit of time, but there was no jobs. Everybody went to London, and in many ways, when I heard and saw the sleeve of Clock Comes Down the Stairs, and they're in London and it's all about London, that was kind of setting me up to go over. And when I went over to London in 1989, I didn't know that many people. And but this film thing I had, I managed to get a job in the film archives of the BBC within maybe 3 or 4 months when I went over. And I moved to Ealing, which I still have a great connection to. And that's where a lot of Brian kind of comes from. So the first year I was over there on my own, I was just kind of working in the BBC, and it sort of contributes to Brian. But, I was a place called Avalon Road, which is in Ealing, West Ealing. It's off the Western Avenue. And I met a good pal called Andy Aldridge, who worked in the BBC with me. And he was a fantastic guy. And I was in the BBC, and we would often be getting out film cans late in the evening. And I said, well, what happens when it's really late in the evening and you're supposed to be going home and somebody asks for film cans, or, needs to get film off us? And they said, well, you'd hang around and give it to them. And I said, really? And yeah, they said, there's one guy in here and he wouldn't do that. He'd be like, I'm not going to do that. This is after the agreed time. And this guy was Andy Aldridge, and Andy Aldridge was a wonderful guy from Cobham, Surrey, and big music fan. And he had connections to bands already. And me and Andy started to go out a bit. And after a while, and we'd go out to gigs. And I kind of remember Ealing at the time where I was living. Ealing reminded me of kind of Dublin, but there was incredible buildings on the Western Avenue, which is the big, huge motorway at the bottom of Ealing. You know, the Western Avenue, the Hoover factory. There was the Viscount building. In fact, we've got a picture of something I remember very vividly. Niall, later on, when he moved over, he moved to Hanger Lane. I was living in Ealing, and after we'd rehearsed at night, I'd walk down the Western Avenue home, and there was a plane on top of the Viscount building, like a Spitfire, like an ornamental Spitfire, a real full-on Spitfire, and it's in that song, Big Green Eyes, the lights of a plane held high above the Western Avenue. And there's also, I'd be at Ealing Broadway station and I'd hear the click of the train. You wouldn't see the train coming down the Central Line. So all these Ealing things kind of fed into Understand.
Yes, my God, that's quite an intense time. I mean, you mentioned a lot of bands from that heady 60s world, and The Action were one of those ones that very early boss kind of turned me on to, who was very into 60s kind of rock, and he loved his obscure music. And I think it was was it Phil Collins and Paul Weller's kind of favourite sort of bands? And I remember having that cassette and being quite obsessed with it because it was so good. But what about the kind of contemporary music scene that was happening, you know, in the UK at that stage, or America or Australia or New Zealand? I
was very fortunate because my friend Graham at the time was a music critic, and I was into... First of all, REM were a huge influence for me, early REM. 1984, I saw... I'd been into the Jam, and there was a band I loved called The Blades. They were kind of a mod band, and the guy from The Blades reviewed the first REM album on a radio show in Ireland, and I couldn't see REM. I could just hear these songs he was playing, and I was just transfixed. It was Murmur, and it was all those wonderful songs on the first REM album. And I didn't see REM because if I'd seen them with their waistcoats and their long hair, I don't think I would have been into them, but I really got into REM. And I'd say to people, people would ask, what kind of bands do you like? And I'd say REM, and they'd always think I was talking about REO Speedwagon. And I was talking about REM for a long time, and they played in Ireland, St. Francis Xavier Hall, 1984. And there was a lot of guys. There was a big Irish band called The House. They were at that gig. The Something Happens, who were another big Irish band. They were at it. The Stars of Heaven. Everybody in Irish indie was at that gig. And I was kind of very into jangly guitar. When I was in Instant Party, I'd very kindly been sold a Rickenbacker guitar by a guy called Tony Maynell and Squire. So I was very into Rickenbackers and jangly guitars. Jangly guitars were my thing. And when I turned up to see REM, I thought that Pete Buck was going to be doing like amazing, intricate jangly guitar patterns at that gig. But he wasn't. He was just playing he was picking out things on the first few frets, and I was just mesmerized by this thing. So I was into that, or early REM, and I was also interested in... there's an American band who aren't a million miles from REM called Miracle Legion. They're from Connecticut. John Peel used to play them a lot. They're a big, big band for me because they have a kind of a warmth. I think, critics were calling it... What do they call it now? They call it... The New Sincere. That's what it was dubbed at one stage. And it was music that was just very, it wasn't music that was kind of trying to disguise what it was being about or being clever. It was music that was from the heart. And if you hear any Miracle Legion records, particularly their first album, you'll hear a lot of Brian, like a lot of how I feel music should be. David, I got a lot out of music when I was young.
So was that called Miracle Legion?
Miracle, yeah, the band. Now, David, they're like, I'm going to tell you that you should know about this band. Why?
Yes, I know. I should. This is
Radio. Okay, there's a band called Radiohead, and Radiohead have called Miracle Legion the best American band ever. So I'm figuring that if you all genuflect to Radiohead, as most people have the last 20 years, pay attention to who they're influenced by. So, yeah, Miracle Legion from Connecticut. It's Mark Mulcahy and guitarist Ray Neal. They were with the band all the way through. So it's kind of very emotive, jangly guitar music, but it's all about childhood. The first album is, even though I grew up in Ireland and they grew up in Connecticut, their first album, The Backyard, it just absolutely, it just touched me in a way, and there's a lot of that kind of vibe, I think, in Understand. There's a American Legion album called Me and Mr. Ray, and the songs like Gigantic Transatlantic Phone Call on that album that wouldn't be a million miles away from American Legion. Listen, it's no problem you not knowing about them, because loads of people don't know about American Legion. They're very, very influential, and for a jangly guitar guy like me, one of these bands, I thought, like the Go-Betweens, I thought Miracle Legion would be huge, but they weren't. But they left behind some fantastic records. In this, but in the same way, I never had to see people at concerts with Miracle Legion, headbands on or anything like that. Never been that big. But I mean, I loved McCarthy. I loved I'm a Wallet, the first McCarthy album, that kind of jangly thing. And my one of my best friends was a music critic, and he was coming up with albums all the time, the Sneetches, and so that they were kind of huge influences. And I loved that's the great thing, I suppose, about getting on Needle Mythology, this reissue, because I loved the first Lilac Time album as well as Go-Betweens. The first Lilac Time album with Black Velvet and all that stuff, Jesus, I absolutely loved all that.
Yes. And were you consuming sort of other art forms like cinema? Was that sort of on your radar as well? Were you sort of going back to kitchen sink dramas, or sort of the classic kind of art house films of the 50s and yes, like what's it, the big Ingmar Bergman film, The Seventh Seal, and then Betty Blue and all that kind of, stuff like Dinah, or I don't know, The Rumblefish, The Outsiders, I don't know, Rosalind and the Lions, and Wings of Desire. Were you embracing a lot of different art at this time?
Yeah, I was, David, because when I first moved to London in '89, I didn't know many people, and Sundays in London were very lonely because I didn't have family over there. I didn't know that many people. But at the time in 1989, there were all these amazing repertory cinemas, art house cinemas, and they would show 3 art house films in a row. So you could go and see Paris, Texas, Wings of Desire, and The American Friend, and you could go and see amazing pictures and I love Michael. A big influence on Brian, I think, and the songs that I wrote is Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger. And it's that kind of, they're 50s, they're called the Archers. I'm sure you know all about them. They're 1950s, 1960s eminent British filmmakers, although Emmerich Pressburger was an immigrant from Eastern Europe. But they did things like A Matter of Life and Death, which is film which goes into colour. It's about David Niven. He's an RAF pilot, and his plane gets shot down, and he's talking. He gets caught in between heaven and earth, and the big screens. You have to see those Michael Powell, Emmerich Pressburger films on big screens in Technicolor, and I did, and I think that kind of fed into my view on life. But I mean, if you go back, I would say that in the mid 80s, David, in Ireland, I was playing jangly guitar, writing, romantic handwritten letters to my girlfriend at the time. And I'd say that's the basis of Brian. I think I do, because it's all that kind of jangly guitar. It's all those kind of emotions and things you're saying and feelings you're having. And I think that's the basis of it. But then when I went to London, I suppose I was very isolated from Ireland, and I missed it, and I missed a lot of people in Ireland. I think now about my own parents, because I've got a son about that age, and I can't imagine what it would be like to just lose him and he'd go off to London. And it wasn't like it is now, where you just were in constant contact. You just kind of went over there, and you mightn't come back, really. You just have a whole world over there. And I left my parents behind, and I was over there, and I kind of.
And what was your brother's career, musical direction at this stage? I was sort of curious because he had been training to become a barrister. He went back to college after the Vipers split. He came back to Ireland. He did go back to college, and then he became a barrister, and he started to set up. And then he went off to London with a guy, his best friend at the time, Nick Kelly, the songwriter. The Fat Lady Sings, and he was one of the original founders of the Fat Lady Sings, and he plays on their first single, Fear and Favour. And I
was hanging around with him a bit, and I was there at their early gigs, and they're all still friends of mine. The Fat Lady Sings. He kind of eventually came back to Dublin, and he's a music business lawyer, and you can look him up. He's got a big law business in Brussels, and he worked for the IFPI or the PPI, and he does music rights and publishing for games and things like that. But my late mother, always said that if two guys came to the door and said they were going to London with a band, he'd just drop everything. And the joke is he actually did that quite a few times because he loves rock and roll and he loves music. I mean, I've hardly picked up a guitar in the last 25 years, but he's been constantly playing. And, he got me into bands like the Blue Nile and stuff. And I know he's not much time for REM, but he's got me into a lot of music, Dave. So, yeah, we're still close. He's the eldest and I'm the youngest.
But you're at that stage, the golden decade of indie pop from the 80s, 83 to 87, which for me is the years of the Smiths and then all the bands that come around that time. There does suddenly feel like this incredibly exciting movement of, all the bands like the Chills and the Go-Betweens and the Triffids and the Mighty Lemon Drops. And, it's just a glorious time, isn't it? The Primitives, Darling Buds and people like that. So what did the Smiths kind of resonate with your DNA or aura at this stage?
They do a little bit, but you just mentioned a band I loved, the Triffids, and the song by the Triffids, The Wide Open Road.
Oh, yes, that's a classic.
It's just something I used to just listen to all the time. And I just loved it, but I loved what it says, like it's a wide open road and now you can't do anything. And that sense of maybe heartbreak and going off. And I think, something that I suppose I better say is every songwriter, David, they create their own universe. Every songwriter and every band, they have their universe. There's something has happened and they draw from that universe and their music comes from that. And I suppose I didn't date that many people. When I was younger, I didn't date that many people. And I had a girlfriend, somewhere a mixture between a girlfriend and a best friend who I was very, very close to. And it would have been unhealthy and bad had we, had it continued, because we were going out for something like 2 years and the natural progression happened, we split up and, I suppose there's a great book on The Wedding Present I've got somewhere, and the author, the biographer of The Wedding Present, talks about Dave Gedge, and he says anyone else would just kind of like just move on. But I suppose being hyper, sensitive or whatever, I suppose it had an impact on me. Again, it was maybe the first person. It was a mixture of a best friend and a girlfriend and someone I confided in a lot, and I just really missed her. There's no other way of saying there's no other way of saying really that I just missed talking to her. I missed her company as much as I missed she was just a great pal, and
yes,
I felt very close to. And we split up, and I did date other people after that in Ireland, but I don't know, there was some sort of thing about it. I don't know. It took a lot out of me. And I think when I got over to London, because the relationship had kind of ended badly, when I went to London, I think it troubled me a great deal that it had ended badly. And it couldn't have continued. It had lived it had come to the end of its natural life or whatever, but it just had ended badly, and Pete Perfida is so funny on his Soho radio show, because he was playing Understood during the week, and he said, "Yeah, Ken, the relationship ended, and by the sounds of it, I don't think Ken ended." It just made me laugh. I just love humor, and I love, and I think that I think we split up, and. Obviously, she dumped me, and, it's important to say as well that, young women's lives aren't about, hanging out with men or, validating men's lives. They go out and live their own lives, and that's what it's all about. So, I think that, when we split up, it was very abrupt, and was it abrupt? It was probably on the cards, but there was no contact. It just ended, and there was never any contact for like 5-6 years, and there was no. I never could ever kind of pick up a phone or write because she'd ended it. So I think I was very troubled by that, and a bit withdrawn, David, very kind of withdrawn and sad about it. And I sat down and kind of wrote Understand the album when I lived in London, and I just wrote it to just try and put some meaning on it, to try and put closure on it in a way. And I didn't write it to have a go at anyone or anything like that. I was totally missing. You can hear it, like pining away for the person that I'd been in a relationship with, and missing them, and just it's in that song, knowing of going out into the big and empty, the sadness of knowing, and the worrying for you, the wishing that somehow we could talk, and there's a lot of that longing all through the album, and it's not having a go at anyone. It's just really, obviously the relationship was kind of, was meant a great deal. And, I think as well, being over in London, and also I can kind of look back on it now and I can say, maybe I was a little bit lost because, I'm a journalist 25 years now and stuff. But at that point in my life, I think that would probably add to it, that I was a bit lost and I didn't really know what I was going to do. And I just missed, doors were opening for them and for all these other people around me. And I had just gone over to London on my own, and I was just in a house in Ealing on my own. And I was just in a bedroom, and I was just trying to find closure on this relationship. And I think by the end of the album, I was saying this to Peter Perfides, that the word understand came up, and towards the end of the Understand album, I sing something like maybe now it's not too late, I understand. And it's full of affection and just what's it full of? It's full of just thank you for that time. I think that's what it says. It just says thank you for that time, for giving me that time, and maybe now I understand. And it's not, I think sometimes when there's a song on the album called You Don't Want a Boyfriend, and I kind of wrote that in a fast kind of way, like a Buzzcocks song. But when I went to record it, I didn't have a band, so I kind of recorded it acoustically. And those kind of lyrics were much more prominent than they were meant to be. But if you're listening to the song You Don't Want a Boyfriend by Brian, it starts and there's all these things going on in the relationship and things are being, recounted. But the song You Don't Want a Boyfriend, it really doesn't happen until the very end of the song, where you're singing like, maybe you leaving me wasn't a bad thing, maybe you hurting me wasn't a bad thing. And that's really, I think the person who's singing the song is really coming clean about the relationship, about how much it meant to them, and how they miss the person, and they're trying to find some sort of closure in it, and that's where it's going. The mad thing is that when we did our first single, A Million Miles, our second single was going to be this really upbeat song called Wonderful. And it was, you could never have, it exists. It was called Wonderful. It was really fast and poppy, and it sounds like the House Martins or something. And it's got jangly guitar, and it's like, and we recorded it. And then I did this song called You Don't Want a Boyfriend as the B-side. And then I was just walking around Ealing listening to the tapes. And I thought, oh my God, this Boyfriend song is everything. It's just so much better, because I tell you why it was better, because Wonderful was produced, and it produced in the sense of like, it was much bigger. It had a bigger, poppier sound, and it wasn't that unusual. But Boyfriend was just so raw, and it was like, maybe you're leaving me and all this, and it had this beautiful guitar in it, and I thought, oh my God, we'll flip this thing, Boyfriend will be the single, we'll make this the single, because this is going to stand out. People are going to hear this and think, that's really, because you got to remember at the time that in Ireland in the 80s, U2 became huge, and then every Irish band were using these delay pedals, and there were just masses. Every Irish band had like this U2 sound, and the reason a lot of Irish critics liked Brian and I suppose Hey Paulette and Brian, the Harvest Ministers, was we weren't doing that. We were Stars of Heaven. We weren't doing that. We were doing this almost acoustic type thing. And our friend Andy Aldridge, he helped us put out "You Don't Want a Boyfriend" as a single, and it just did amazing things. In Ireland, again, it was a big critics poll. Hot Press loved it, and it got a lot on the radio. And Stephen Ryan, who was one of my heroes in Stars of Heaven, he heard it. He loved it, and Setanta heard it and loved it, and a lot of people, really liked it. So it was the right thing to do. I better explain as well that when I went to London, I met a guy. Kate Suter was good. Kate Suter was a friend of mine, an Irish girl. She was dating a friend of mine, one of my best friends, and her sister was married to a guy called Leo Finlay, Leo Finlay's a very famous Irish journalist, deceased now. He worked for Music Week, and he wrote for Sounds. And I met him and I played him some of my songs. And Leo Finlay in Music Week wrote a review. He had an A&R column in Music Week, which was the trade publication. And he wrote, "This Brian demo is the best thing I've heard. Every discerning A&R man in the world should be listening to this Brian demo." Oh my God, we lived in Ealing, and we had an answer phone, and the answer phone rang with A&R men ringing all over London, all over Scotland. We had guys from America ringing, all looking to get their hands on this tape. We just kind of couldn't believe it. And around that time as well, none of them wanted to sign the band because it wasn't the kind of commercial band that maybe they were hoping it was going to be. But around that time, we bumped into Keith Cullen, who ran Setanta Records. And I don't think we just didn't hit it off, because we came with all these Irish clippings of how regarded our music was in Ireland. And Setanta was an amazing record label, and I'd love to talk about it for a sec, because it was set up by this guy Keith Cullen, who was a push bike courier. He based it in his squat in Camberwell, himself and his girlfriend, I think at the time, Louise. They started it, and then Keith did it on his own. But he did Beethoven, and then he did a band called Into Paradise, who are an amazing Irish band from Churchtown in Dublin, who are a bit like Adrian Borland, a bit very influenced by the sound. And they had an album called Under the Water. That album took off for Setanta, and I remember seeing them, Into Paradise, playing at the London School of Economics, and there was such an emotional charge about them, and so at that time Setanta was the label that every Irish band wanted to be on, because they signed the Frank and Walters. The Frank and Walters became huge. Into Paradise was signed by Ensign Records, and what happened was, I think Niall, who had come over and worked with me, and we got that Music Week review, me and Niall, and we'd been on late night buses, recording in studios and coming home together, back out to Ealing and having a ball as great friends, because Niall was brilliant and he gave me the confidence to do it. Niall had a lot of stuff. He was a very big guy in advertising, and he went back to Ireland to work in advertising, and I kind of finished up what I was doing. I completed the cycle of the songs, and after that, Setanta, Keith Cullen came along, and we wanted to re-record the songs. We wanted to, get in with a producer, a big name producer, because that's what people did. And that was a problem, because in Ireland at the time, Irish bands who sounded a certain way, they'd be signed by a record label, and the record label would appoint an English or an American producer, and then they'd make this album that didn't sound anything like them. Like they would come back to Dublin with this record that wasn't them, and what is this? And the producer had kind of given them this sound, but that didn't happen with Brian, because what we had was demos. And I wanted money out of Keith Cullen to record all these songs again. And Keith Cullen, very cleverly said, no, the feel of this is all here. These songs, this feel, you're not going to get this any better. This is absolutely perfect. It suited him because, he didn't have the money to put me in to, probably to pay to a big studio to put me in. So we did that. Keith picked out the kids' covers on the children's faces on the cover, which was perfect for the sleeve. It came out at the right kind of price, and at the time Setanta was very hip, and I was just so surprised, because growing up, I couldn't believe that I'd made something that was popular, because I suppose growing up in 80s in Dublin, I was quite a gentle kind of person, and I played guitar, and I was quite I was quite into books and films and art, and that's made me a journalist for the last 25 years and given me the most incredible life, right?
Yes.
Back then, as a teenager, that wasn't good at all. People were into soccer and football, and they weren't, they didn't have any, unless you could, my parents were lovely, gentle people, and they read a lot of newspapers and they were into books. And they gave me this love of art and all this. So I had all this. And so I couldn't believe when Understand came out. Like, I couldn't believe how many people liked it, and I couldn't believe as well the women liked it, because I hadn't dated that many people. I couldn't believe the women. Of course, women loved it, because here's this guy singing from the heart, very openly. I'm not, David, I'm not sure I would sing, from the heart. I don't know if I'd be that open now where I am in life as I was then. But at the time, I didn't think anything of it, because this kind of music that I was affected by, people were this emotional. And there's a lot of emotion in, there's a lot of emotion in Understand. And I think as well, there's a song called Don't Leave Me Behind on Understand, and it's about my ex-girlfriend's house. And, you kind of like, obviously I'd spent a lot of time there, and she had a younger brother and sister who I adored and, I was so fond of. And her dad, he used to play records, and when we split up, I never saw them again. Like, I never, ever saw them again. And I was like, I don't know, 18 or 19, and I really missed them.
Yeah.
And I think I wrote that song, Don't Leave Me Behind, because, because I just missed them. And I was a young guy, and I missed their company, and I missed seeing them. And I realized I was never going to see them again. So that song is kind of special. That's not about my dad singing or playing his records. It's about my ex-girlfriends. But it was that house and that feeling and that place. And, it was just very special to me. And I wrote that in my box room in London, and I was just trying to get back into the feel of her. And anytime I hear those that keyboard at the start of Don't Leave Me Behind, it kind of brings me back to her house and her younger brother and sister and her family. And they were really lovely people, and I was very connected to them. And unfortunately, the relationship came to an end, and I never saw them again. So I wrote that song.
Yes. Did you ever, did you ever see your ex-girlfriend again after, you said 5 years, but did you see her after that? Have you ever sort of bumped into each other and had a coffee and said, blimey, that was a long time, what a weird little chapter of our lives that was?
I tell you, there's a song on the Keith Cullen at the time kept the song off Understand. There was a song called If You Knew, and Keith didn't want it on the album. He just thought it was too personal and too sad, and which is kind of a bit weird. It's a bit like kind of, someone saying to Ozzy Osbourne, you can't put that song on your album, Ozzy. It's too heavy metal, because that's what they Understand is. It's all that kind of emotion and stuff. But it kind of ended badly. And as I said, I was very close, and she was like my best friend. And I remember, she had lots of stuff going for her. She was very bright. She went off to college, and I bumped into a friend of mine, and months and months later, and he said to me, he says, "Oh yeah, I bumped into your ex-girlfriend, and I asked about you, and she threw her eyes up to heaven, like she threw her eyes up to heaven." I was like, "Oh Jesus, not ask me about that guy." And at the time, David, I was just so loyal to that person, my ex. I just couldn't kind of believe it, because she'd been in my house. I'd been in her house. My aunts lived in Glasnevin. She'd been in their house, and this was a friend of mine coming back to me, and it was that sort of like, she's kind of slagging you off, and I just wasn't at the time. I was just in bits, and what I should have said was, well, who cares about her or whatever? But I just didn't say anything, so it kind of left me. It just left me not really wishing to be back in contact, because it was just probably going to destroy me if it did,
Yes.
So it's like, it's just a way that, it's like this for some people. They can get into relationships, they can be in relationships, and they come out of them and they can be devastated. there's other people who are like Jerry Seinfeld. Do you ever watch Seinfeld, David?
No.
Okay, well, Seinfeld is an American comedy with Jerry Seinfeld, and in Seinfeld, Jerry Seinfeld is dating a new girlfriend. Every week he's dating a new girlfriend. It's practically a storyline. And I think sometimes you can kind of attach, you can attach importance to a relationship when the other person, they're just moving through life. It doesn't mean anything. And I think it's in one of those Richard Linklater films, like Before Sunrise or Before Sunset or something.
Yes.
They're talking about, do you ever think of, how often do you think your ex who dumped you thinks about you, and they don't, and then the person says back, well, how often do you think about the person that you dumped? And it's like, so I don't think, I don't think these things have the same significance or whatever. But back then, and I'm kind of glad because, like, I suppose understand, I've had some lovely, messages from men and women about understand over the years, and people who told me their marriages had split up and they'd played it or got them through a particular time. And we're probably going to talk about it, but at a certain point I gave up music, and it wasn't until the internet came along in like the, I don't know, mid 90s, which was a couple of years after I'd stopped, I realised how many people had this album. And even now, I was in Scotland doing that Blue Nile documentary, and I met journalists who had it over there, just ordinary people who had it. So I had no idea that so many people liked this record, and I probably would have been encouraged and stuck at it a bit more if I had, So I was going to say, I did understand, and it came out, and it was brilliant for Setanta, and the NME had it on there. They loved it. Colin McCallaghan, who worked in Setanta with Keith Cullen, he put an awful lot into it as well. He was like the PR man in Setanta, and all these people came out of the woodwork and loved it. And when Understand came out as well, something had happened that I want to give this guy a plug, because when the Boyfriend single came out, I didn't get anywhere. This was before Setanta actually decided to put out the album. I think I had a few copies of You Don't Want a Boyfriend, the Brian single, and I dumped it. I dumped some of them in the Tape and Record Exchange, and it had some amazing sleeve notes on the back, this Boyfriend single. You see it there? That's it. So on the back, Alma Reynolds of Des Moines beat her fiancé to death with an encyclopedia in 1989. She struck him with the 2,000-page volume a total of 12 times while he lay in bed. When she was arrested, she asked one of the officers if she could keep the book. She said she wanted to remember him. She wanted it to remember him by, right? So my friend Graham had written that. So it was on the single. And this guy, a guy called Paul Robinson, later to be known as Dean Talent, he picked it up and he loved the sleeve notes, and he brought it back to his friend, a lady called Claire Wad, who ran Sarah Records. Claire and Matt. And they loved it. And Setanta anyway, Keith Cullen got on the phone and he decided he was going to put out the stuff. And out of the blue, I came home from the BBC one day. There was the phone rang, and it was this lovely soft voice on the phone, and it was Claire Wad, and she was saying, is this because it was just a phone number on the single, a contact number, and she said, is this Brian or whatever? And at the time I was working in the BBC. I hadn't been in England that long, and I really didn't know. I just thought it was somebody at work winding me up, and I was quite rude to her. I was shouting down the name of the person in work who I thought was winding me up. And Claire Wad was just really lovely and patient, and eventually she gave up and said, no, she said, I am. And it was a couple of days later I realised that, oh my God, it was the famous Claire Wad of Sarah Records. So I rang her back and I apologised, and I went down to a Sarah gig, and at this stage I was going to do the record with Setanta, and I told them that. And that's the amazing thing about Sarah Records, who I have a lot of admiration for, Matt and Claire. any other record label, if they wanted to sign you and they didn't get to sign you, they just slag you off, or you just be invisible to them. But they were so into it. They were so into the recordings. They loved the Boyfriend single that when the Setanta album came out, understand, they were giving out copies of the Boyfriend single at the Sarah Christmas party. They were telling their friends to buy it. They were just absolutely brilliant. So I not only had this Irish Setanta Records audience, I had this Sarah, which was arguably probably bigger than the Setanta audience. And I think Keith had suggested that Brian could be on Setanta in the UK and Sarah could export it. But I think Matt and Claire, they realised that was maybe them doing all the work. I don't know. They didn't want to do it anyway. But subsequently, my friends, the Harvest Ministers, who are friends of mine from Dublin, who are an amazing band, they sent me their single. I sent it to Claire, and the Harvest Ministers ended up on Sarah Records, which is a weird thing because the Harvest Ministers were friends of mine. They were playing in a pub in town in Dublin, and there's no possible way they would connect up to indie music in the UK. But yet, because I was there in England, I'd moved to England and I was in indie circles, the Harvest Ministers ended up first on Sarah Records and then on Setanta Records.
Blimey, God, there's a lot to sort of digest there, actually. You have mentioned them briefly, but the impact of bands like you had, obviously, Boomtown Rats, but then, U2, was that something that you just made a point of ignoring at that stage? Or a band like the Hothouse Flowers, were they just like, I forget that, Was it the case that because they were home, they were part of your world? A bit like, I suppose, if a band was big in Norwich, likelihood is you'd ignore them because you think, oh, I've met them and they're arses, I don't like them. What was that kind of relationship? Suddenly realising you've got a band bigger than REM almost.
Well, I think that I loved the first U2 album, Boy, and I loved the early. I think I bought Out of Control, the first EP. I bought a lot of singles around then. I love Boy. Boy's one of my favourite albums. And I love things like A Day Without Me, that early U2 I absolutely love. I suppose the problem was, David, that a lot of Irish bands started to sound like them. And, it wasn't really what I was going for. But I'm friends with a lot of people who were in successful bands around then. And Frank Kearns, who was the guitarist in Cactus World News, and my mod band Instant Party played with Cactus World News. Frank Kearns is a dear friend of mine. He produced, he engineered my REM doc and my Blue Nile doc, and he had amazing adventures with Cactus World News. They're friends of mine. Fiachna from the Flowers is a broadcaster on Irish radio at the moment. He's a big fan of the Trash Can Sinatras. These people would all be friends of mine at the time. In fact, my wife is a huge Hothouse Flowers fan. So I don't know. I think I was into indie stuff. I think I was into a band I loved were the Stars of Heaven, who were John Peel loved, and I can remember doing some sort of computer course or something, and they had a song out called Never Saw You, which was on the Holyhead EP. And there was a guitar solo in the middle of it. And I remember I was so obsessed with learning the guitar solo. I was in college or whatever I was doing. And I ran home on the bus at lunch hour to get the guitar out to learn the guitar solo, had my lunch, then jumped back on the bus and went back into the college in the afternoon. But I loved them. They were doing something different, the Stars of Heaven. I loved their albums. And, their first album, Peel loved them. The second album kind of died a death. But they were doing something different like us. And there was bands like Hey Paulette I loved as well, who were doing something different. They were indie bands. There was a whole indie scene in Dublin at the time. The underground venue where A House and Something Happens and all those guys kicked off. And, a lot of my friends were journalists as well. So I'd met a lot of them. And the funny thing was, around age 20, I said to a friend of mine, I said, do you think I could be a journalist? Because I love music. And they said, no. No. You could no. I don't think you could. No, you wouldn't be able to be a journalist. You wouldn't have it at all. And I can tell you now, I think I've won 3 journalism awards, national journalism awards in Ireland, and I've worked for the 2 biggest broadsheets in the country. I've worked for nearly every Irish newspaper, and I've had an absolute ball. I mean, who wouldn't? And so I think, that's a lesson, David, to you and to anyone who's listening, that maybe back then people want you in a particular box. They want you.
Yes.
They want you to be somebody. And if I ever had a chance to talk to young musicians, I'd love to. I'd say, just remember the people around you. Sometimes they want you to be a certain type of person, and they're not really able for it when you break out of that. And I got a bit of that. Now, I wasn't famous, but I got a bit of that when Understand came out. There was a few friends, musicians who wouldn't talk to me. They just wouldn't. They just couldn't deal with it at all back in Dublin. They couldn't, believe it. And I think that the people that you look around and see who's happy for you when you're doing well, and they're truly your friends.
Well, absolutely. I think there was an Oscar Wilde one, wasn't there, about it's easy to sympathise with somebody who's going through a hard time, but it's sometimes harder to enjoy someone when they're having success. And Morrissey's solo album, We Hate It When Our Friends Become Successful. So it does capture that. I mean, I know this isn't Dublin, but they were another, I don't know if they were on John Peel, but I do know they were on the Tube. Cruella de Vil, did they come onto your radar? I mean, I know they're from Belfast, but I mean,
Cruella de Vil are just another kind of Irish. I mean, they're just an Irish band, more an art house band, a very mainstream band. They wouldn't be indie at all. Something, David, I think it's important to say is, and this is really important to say on the C86 podcast, Understand could never have happened. The Brian album, Understand, could never have happened on a major label. Indie labels... Major labels are all about making money and product and commerce, right? That's what major labels are about. Indie labels are about something much more personal. So what I was doing, writing this album about a breakup, Understand, the personal, the emotional, that's perfect for indie records, for an indie label. And Setanta, it's absolutely perfect, because no one is going to let you do that, on a major label. And I worked with producers. There was a second Brian album later on, and I worked with producers, and they would have changed it. They'd be really clever. The songs would have very clever intros and very clever and premeditated middle eights, and all this artifice going on. And if you listen to Understand the album, there's no intros. It just comes in. Every single song comes in straight away, and I start singing, And I was listening back to it. I had to, because when it was suggested, when I first got this call, that Understand might be coming out, the master tapes, we weren't really sure what was going on. Now, there was talk that it might be mastered from a CD, right? Now, I was not going to let anything be mastered from a CD. It was discussed a couple of years ago, and I said, there's no way. So what I had to do was get all the DATs of the original sessions. And my engineer, Billy Farrell, we got a DAT machine, and we basically put Understand together all over again. We put all the recordings in order, and God, thank you, Billy. Even the amount of seconds between each song, everything is perfect, and it's a much better pressing. Like the vinyl, the sound of it, the Needle Mythology Understood compilation, the sound of the songs on Understand are just much better. It's quite incredible. But I was listening back to my own voice, whatever I am, 19 or 20, and this just in the song Understand. First of all, there's a reference to Against the Tide. I loved Noel Brown. Noel Brown was a very famous health minister in Ireland in the 1950s, and he wiped out tuberculosis in Ireland. And I had his book, and I loved his book. So there's a reference to Noel Brown in there too. But I think listening to the way I sing on Understand, and I didn't write that song about me. I think I had a crush on a woman in the BBC I was friends with, and maybe we got on great, and she was always telling me about how terrible her day was going. And I think I wrote the song for her. I think I wrote the song for her, but then everybody heard it and assumed I'd written it for me, but I hadn't. It was just empathizing with somebody. People would go to her to sort things out, and she could get very down about it. But anyway, and what I wanted to say was, when I heard the song Understand, somewhere, I don't know, after the second chorus, I come in and I sing, I understand. And there's just something about the way I sing it kind of reminds me of how I was when I was that age in my early 20s in London, kind of very withdrawn. And I think, I did an NME interview around that time with Ian McCann of the NME, and he said he found me he wrote in the NME, he said that I was a bit sad and a bit troubled, and I think kind of withdrawn and just a bit messed up, and I think that's what it was. And that was the great thing about Understand, David, that it was amazing to hear these emotions and sadness and things you were carrying around. It was amazing to hear them.
Yes, I'd imagine.
Speakers, and you could, you were getting rid of this, and it's my favorite word, cathartic. You were getting rid of all this sadness, and so I felt, oh my God, I felt so much better. And when I did the you were asking me about the my girlfriend who had written the songs about, my ex-girlfriend. A couple of years later, when I was in London, Niall came back from Ireland and said, "Oh, your ex-girlfriend's, she's pregnant. She's having a baby. Nothing to do with me. Like a subsequent thing. You better be careful editing this. Let me just restart this again. Yeah. So a couple of years later, the ex-girlfriend, I found out she was. Someone came over and told me that she was having a baby, and it was years and years later, and I was in London and I hadn't been in contact with her. And I was just, I felt so much, how she was coping and how she was getting on. And I didn't pick up the phone, but I wrote that song Knowing, which is the lead song on the Plains EP. And that's what I wrote it acoustically. And then we went into the studio and I did a bigger version of it, but it's all in the lyrics, the sadness of knowing, the worrying for you, the wishing that somehow we could talk. So I'd heard, she was having a baby, and I wrote that song, and that's what that song's about. So I don't think I've ever told anyone that before, but that's what that song's about. But
Knowing, yes.
Yeah, the Plains EP, that's all about Ealing. And I lived in Ealing, and the planes stack up over Ealing to land at Heathrow Airport. And, you can see them in the sky. And I think I saw this as some sort of metaphor for, people. And, I was very much in England at that part of my life. I was very much just on ice. I was just in between a lot of different things. And there's a lot of references to the Western Avenue, Park Royal, and stuff like that. So I did the Plains EP, and I actually, at that stage, I did it with Ian Catt, and he was brilliant. And it has that feel. And then...
what happened to that track you mentioned? The boss of the label said, no, that's not going on the album. What was that track called?
If You Knew, and it's now on the album. It's called...
Good.
And it's on Understood, and it's finally getting its release, and it's the very last song. And I suppose it's just about, that thing where I was talking about, that disassociation that goes on that you're not really expecting or able for, or just, and I suppose it's just maybe really knowing somebody really well. And that goes back to that line in Boyfriend: the more you give yourself away to someone, the less they'll think of you. I don't know, but it's there. It's part of it. And at the time, Keith said to me, could you come up with anything else, And, because remember that a lot of the Setanta bands, and these people are friends of mine, The Power of Dreams and the Franks and Into Paradise, they had quite loud songs. And Keith said it to me at the time, could you come up with something with a bit more welly, like the album, but maybe a bit more welly. And I went off and wrote this song called You Can't Call Home, which is the third song on Understand. And it's it's not my favorite song, David, but it fulfills a role on that album because, otherwise it just gives it a backbone. You can't call home, and it's everything's kind of turned up to 90 on it. And when I was chatting to a Scottish journalist about my Blue Nile documentary, and it just bizarrely, he turned out to be a Brian fan, and he had that album, and he said, "Yeah, I love that song. You can't call home." Somebody, I was
Blimey.
doing a thing with RT Radio, and the guy loves it, and he says, "I love the song," and he put it on. So, listen, I just write the songs. It's up to you. Like I can't. I just write them, and there's lyrics for some of the songs on. You'll see the songs I like because Needle asked me to do a lyric sheet, and I didn't do all the lyrics. I tell you, the lyrics are well worth having a look at, but I didn't do all the lyrics, but I left out things. I just, I put in the things I wanted to put in. So there's some, so I had to sit down and write out these lyrics. So that's something that you're getting with this album as well.
Yes, that must have been quite interesting and kind of returning to a diary virtually, wasn't it?
Yeah,
At that stage?
you know what? That's exactly what Understand is. It's a diary. But, the thing about it was I'd spent my whole life, because I felt so much, I could empathize and I could connect with music. All I wanted to do was do music. And after I did the album and the EP, I found it really hard. I kind of, that's the thing about, people want to be musicians, commercial musicians. They've got to get up in the morning, at 10 o'clock and find something and write a song about it. And I put all that emotion into Understand and the Plains EP, and they all came out of emotion. And I started to work on a second album. And to me, it sounded like the first album. It just hadn't moved on. And I understand this now, David. I understand that to be creative, you've got to be taking in new influences. And I wasn't. I was in the same job in the BBC. I paid for the second Brian single. I put a lot of money into the recordings, and I had a big loan with the NatWest Bank, and I was kind of trapped. Now, like Keith Setanta wanted another album, I was trapped in this BBC job paying back this loan. And what we should have done really was just clear off the loan and gone back to Ireland, but I didn't. So I had this terrible pressure with Setanta because they had got a lot of interest in the Setanta, in the Brian album. It had come out on Virgin Records in France. It was selling all over the place, and people wanted the next record. And I felt I couldn't write songs unless I was feeling it, and I couldn't feel anything. So I just said to them, "Listen, I just don't feel anything." I'm not, at that age, I'm just not in control of what I'm feeling. It's a bit like why were you so sad when you split up with your girlfriend? Why could you not write, a second record at that stage? But I couldn't. It didn't feel right. So I got stuck in London for a few years, and amazingly, in 1995, I got redundancy out of the BBC and the film library where I was working, Northfields in West London. And I moved back to Ireland. Oh my God, it was incredible. Like one day, I had friends, Ria Matthews, and she lived in a place called Termonfeckin. Ria Matthews is the twin sister of Arthur Matthews, who's one of the Father Ted writers, and they had an amazing house up on the coast in Termonfeckin. And Ria worked in Dublin during the week, but during the week, and then she came home at the weekends, and that suited me. So I went up and lived there, and I was in this huge house on the coast, and I started writing songs. My head was clear again. I think I wrote 3 songs in one day, and I started to write again, and it was just the most amazing summer, 1995, and I got back in contact with Setanta, and Keith, to his credit, he was willing to let me go back and record again. And at the time, Keith's partner, Nina, worked in the Cocteau Twins. She was the studio manager at the Cocteau Twins studio in Richmond. So I was over back and forth recording the second Brian record, which is called Bring Trouble. And this is a totally different record. I don't know if you know the second, but it's pop. I was having the happiest time of my life. There's a song called "On a Roll." If you can play a bit of that, you'll get the vibe of it. But and it was pitch dark, and it was clear skies in Termonfeck, and it's out over the ocean. It's like you're in the countryside. You can see all the stars. So there's all these songs about stars and about the galaxies, like light years, which I love, on the second Brian album, Bring Trouble, and it's one of the happiest times of my life. And uh, I was in the International Bar one night, and I saw this woman in the International Bar one night, and I fell in love with her. And the the most luck I've ever had in my life, David, was that she fell in love with me. That this woman I fell in love with me, and that totally changed my life, because, that was my wife, Deirdre, and there's a lot of songs on the second album about, me and Deirdre, Wherever We're Going, which is the last song about us. We had a lot of friends in Whelan's Bar, and we just had these amazing romance in Ireland, and we were out late, and we just had a ball going to things. And with the Setanta thing, she was going to art college in London. She's a book conserver, and we went back over to England, and we were going out through Setanta, we were able to go to all the best music and gigs. And I remember we once went to see Edwyn Collins in the Astoria, and he was brilliant. And Edwyn Collins is a great guy. And I was talking to some people at the bar, and they all lived on a street. And Edwyn Collins lived on a street in North London, and he was playing a gig in the Astoria, and he got a coach, and he got some mate of his to go around and knock on all the doors and said, "Edwyn in number 12 is playing the Astoria tonight, and if you want to come to the gig and have free drink all night and go to the gig, get on the bus." So he brought his whole neighbourhood, Edwyn Collins, to this gig in the Astoria. And I thought to myself, God, if you're going to be some kind of pop star, be the pop star that Edwyn Collins is going to be.
Yes, God, that is so nice.
Yeah,
that is so so this time here, this is kind of the John Major years, isn't it, for us in the UK? So I mean, there's a lot of optimism, well, a feeling of optimism in the air at that time, because the economy starts to bounce, doesn't it? And there's suddenly that change out of the 80s with Thatcherism and high unemployment and all those kind of job seekers allowance and enterprise allowance schemes. So did you?
I was sad. Yeah, I was. The thing I was sad about when I went back to England was I missed Margaret Thatcher's. I missed Tony Blair. I missed Labour getting back into power, because I'd voted for Neil Kinnock. His seat was in Ealing, and I'd voted for Neil Kinnock, and the whole Labour thing at the time I was very interested in, and so I missed all that. But I came back, and the album came out. It got delayed a bit. We had an amazing producer called Chenzo Townsend, and there's some beautiful songs. In fact, when I heard from Needle Mythology and they said, "Listen, we're going to re-release your album," I was thinking, "Oh my God, this record's going to get out." And they said, "No, it's the first album we want to release." But the second Brian album is called Bring Trouble, and I was in the Cocteau Twins studio, and there's a song on it which is my favourite Brian song, called Light Years, which I wrote up about in Termonfeckin, and it's about the solar wind and being out at space, and raging, it's a song about traveling through space and the night sky, and it's romantic, and it's everything I wanted to write, in a song. And that's on the second Brian album. And this, On a Roll, where, it's all about coming back to Ireland, where people understand you and take you to their hearts. And it's just such a beautiful record. It's such a happy time in my life. And Bring Trouble came out. I was working with a producer called Chenzo Townsend, who was a brilliant guy, and he subsequently went off to work with U2. And Chenzo was brilliant, and there was stupid lyrics I was going to put on the album, and he talked me out of them. He was a brilliant he's a brilliant person, and just a great person who understands humans and how humans are. And Chenzo produced that album, Chenzo Townsend, and it came out and it was very pop, and it did very well in Ireland. I was back in Ireland. I moved back to Ireland around 2000, 99, 2000, and It did very well in Ireland, and the main single off it, I suppose it would be more, you know, I think it would be more Prefab Sprout, more Blue Nile, more pop, you know. And at the
Right.
time, Setanta had kind of had success with the Divine Comedy. They had a radio department, and there was an appetite to do a more. And I was feeling very happy as well, and I just wanted to get it out there, you know. So the single "Turn Your Lights On," like, you know, which was the lead single off it, you would walk into like a supermarket in Ireland and it would be on the radio. It would be on commercial radio stations. People had never played the first album were playing it on the radio in Ireland. You'd hear it all the time. And in fact, 1999, the Hot Press Music Awards, Turn Your Lights On by Brian is nominated one of the Irish singles of the year. And U2 are one of the other Irish singles of the year. So you're actually in a category with U2. And I was at the Hot Press Awards. So that was kind of, but at the same time, you know, Setanta had put a lot of money into it, but although it was doing well in Ireland, I don't think it did what they wanted it to do in England. And maybe they were looking at me doing some more records. But from the start of Bring Trouble, maybe, which was around 95 to 95, came out around 99. It took about 4 years because it's just various delayed. We were kind of trying to get it done with studio time, and Keith's girlfriend at the time, Nina, was brilliant. She was getting me in when the studio, you know, wasn't busy, and everybody was really helping, but it took a long time to get done. And during that time, David, a lot of my friends, they got married, they got mortgages, and I was basically, as a musician, and don't get me wrong, it was the most amazing life, because at the time there was a kind of a living to be had being a musician. And I was living up in Termonfeckin and I was doing music, and, you know, I met my wife, and maybe I was so full of, you know, positivity, you know, she, you know, that was part of the attraction for me as well with her. But it couldn't go on really. And I just, I was just living on when I got to London, friends of mine were putting me up when I was recording, and, you know, my parents, you know, were helping me as well, and it just couldn't go on. And so around 2001, 2001, my friend Niall Austin, who'd been in Brian with me, he put a tape recorder into my hand, and he'd set up a kind of a CD-ROM magazine. This was before the internet really got going, where if you wanted to watch something on your computer, you watched it on a CD-ROM. And he literally said to me, I'm doing this magazine. You're going to interview all the bands and all the artists and all the people. And I knew a lot of people in the arts. I knew a lot of comedians. I certainly knew a lot of musicians. And I found myself a journalist. And I found a career. And within about 3 or 4 months, it had taken off. I was writing for the Herald. And after years and years, David, of doing jobs that I wasn't very good at, I was in something I was really good at. And more than that, I had a work ethic and I really enjoyed it. And I think a lot of people that get into the career they want to get into in their 30s, because I didn't write for a newspaper till I was about 35. I absolutely loved it. I couldn't believe it. I was like, what? You're going to let me go and see this film? I'm going to interview Alan Parker about the Commitments. You're going to fly me on a plane to London to interview the Flaming Lips, like about the soft button. And at the time, you know, I was meeting journalists who had been doing it for a couple of years and were a bit kind of pissed off doing it. And I was kind of going, are you crazy? This is the best job ever. Because I just thought it was so interesting. And all those things, you know, all the things about me when I was younger that were a disadvantage, you know, my interest in things, my interest in books and music, and knowing a lot about Thin Lizzy, knowing a lot about the Boomtown Rats because my brother had toured with them. Like, all those things kind of paid off. And there's a guy called Dave O'Donoghue who was in a Setanta band called The Floors. And he, you know, he's a very talented writer and director. And he said to me a couple of years ago, you did it. You did it. You managed to turn your hobby, what you loved, into your job. And I did. So I want to say I've been a print journalist for broadsheets, for popular newspapers. I've been showbiz editors and entertainment editors. That's what they call them in broadsheets. And I've been doing that for 25 years. And I've had the best of life. And people I think people contact me about Understand, and I think I'd love to say that I've had a ball. I've had an absolute ball, and then what are we now? We're in the summer of 2025, and I get a call to say from Pete Perfides to say that he's going to bring out Understand on his record label. And when Pete Perfides first approached me with this, he had reviewed Brian back in the day, and the last couple of years, there's been various people have been looking at Setanta Records, and they weren't there at the time, but they're kind of rewriting the story a little bit, and they're deciding what was the important band. So maybe about a year ago, 2 years ago, I could see the Brian thing, kind of Brian as a band really not mattering. I think somebody said they went on the Wikipedia and there was no mention of Brian. So anyway, I thought, well, I'm very happy with my life, and these records are there, but I've got this wonderful thing, and it's the people who like to understand, like the people who had made a connection to people like Pete Perfides. So suddenly Pete Perfides goes, I love this album, I'm going to put it out. And remember that Needle Mythology's their motto is giving beautiful records the release they deserve. So I woke up a couple of months ago, and I got all these messages, and it was because Pete Perfides on his Facebook had said, "Oh, I'm mastering this album. It's by my favorite one-named Irish band on Setanta Records." And suddenly, I'm getting everybody, and now I've been hearing it on the radio. Tom Dunn's been playing it every night this week, and there's been some lovely pieces written, and it's wonderful. It's coming out, and it's wonderful. It's coming out on Needle Mythology, because the Lilac Time, Stephen Duffy are on Needle Mythology, and
Yes,
the go-betweens, and Tanita Tickerham, who I love from the Cathedral. I love Tanita Tickerham. She's done records on them as well. So I couldn't be in a better place as regards the label bringing out the record. I just want to support them like in any way I can. And I suppose I just say about Understand that the album, it's just a lot of feeling and a lot of emotion. I was just pining away for someone that I loved, and I just missed them, and I just wanted to chat to them. And I was just in England, and I wrote it. And it's not really about studios. It's not really about technology. It's just about the feeling that comes off that record. And as I get older, I realize that that's all it takes. It's the feeling, and that comes off songs, the feeling that comes off a record. And that's why the record is being released on because there were bigger Irish bands making more expensive records on on expensive major labels. But, Keith Cullen had it right. He knew that the vibe, the feeling was there, and he was, he got it right, and it came out, and now it's getting re-released. And people who never, doing journalism for 25 years, there are people who have no idea I was a musician, and they're kind of, a bit surprised by it. But it's part of who I am, and I've got a son of, who's 20. He's never seen me with a guitar in my hand, but we were back. Me and Billy were back. We got out of Rickenbacker, and we were just back sorting it all out, getting the reissue together. And you can see some of my videos playing a bit of guitar on my Instagram account.
Yes,
and you can hear my music docs as well, all on my Linktree on X at Ken Sweeney, and I'm on all the other channels as well, Blue Sky or whatever. So
it's all there. So how many you've got? Is it coming out on vinyl, CD, and digital downloads?
It is. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. So it's coming out on June 27th. It's coming out in teal vinyl, which is a kind of a green vinyl, which looks fantastic. It's got a lyric sheet, the vinyl, and it's got actually the vinyl doesn't have a lyric sheet. The teal vinyl has a wonderful picture taken by a BBC friend of mine called Martin Sapshead of the Viscount building on the Western Avenue, and it's got it's an amazing package. And then the CD has lyrics, has a whole lyric sheet in it, and it's got some pictures as well. So the CD, there's coloured vinyl, there's normal black vinyl, and there's a CD, and so it's got Understand It's got this extra track called If You Knew, which we never got on the original album. And then it's got remixed the 4 songs on the Plains EP. So altogether, you've got like, I don't know, 13 songs or something. And it sounds amazing. And it's lovely it's coming out. And it's hitting new people because I've got a Spotify account as an artist, and I can see, my streams up 150%. And I don't know digitally if we'll put it up. The Plains EP was never digitally put up. It's not there. You can't get it. You can't download it or anything like that. So you can only get that Plains EP now on this Needle Mythology reissue, and it's there. So, but there's a lot of Brian stuff, David, I'd love to get out. Like that original Million Miles demo that I recorded on my own, like the very first one, like when my brother had booked the studio, that's there. There's a lot of Brian material post Understand. There's a whole second album, and I think I wrote 40 songs for the second album. I think we used about 11 or 12. So I hope maybe to get them out in some way, if there's enough interest, but it's fabulous that a label like Needle Mythology, and I can't thank Peter Perfides enough.
Yes.
Thank the people. And I suppose the last, 20 years I've been on X, Twitter, retweeting other bands, tweets, because I know how important it is on Band Friday. I know how important it is for them to get their music out. And I've been supporting other bands and retweeting other artists and other musicians. So I'm now seeing if they're retweeting me finally out of the blue, with a Brian album. So, there's some lovely people. Chris Messler, a lot of the people who worked in Setanta, there was some wonderful people working there. But I kind of remember the early days. I remember these people like the Franken Walters are still very, they're still great friends of mine. They're very sincere people. Into Paradise and Craig from the Paradreams and the Harvest Ministers and the Catchers, and it's a wonderful kind of label. And I just feel pleased that I grew up on the Navan Road, which is, like, as I mentioned at the start, it's by the Phoenix Park. And Hot Press magazine, which was the Irish music magazine, they said that the Navan Road was like the centre of young bands. So every cul-de-sac in the Navan Road would have had a band or a guy strumming a guitar. And I'm just astonished that I managed to get my music out, that I managed to.
Yes.
There's people who like it in Japan, and, there's people who like it in Australia. It gets played in America. It's turned up in documentaries. There's no one marketing it, but, there's that theme on Understand. So the repackage is called Understood, and Pete Perfides came up with that title. I think originally I wanted to call the reissue So Dada, right? That's a Portuguese term for a yearning tinged with resignation and the melancholy you feel longing for someone or something you have lost. I wanted to call the album that. But Pete Perfides said, no, let's call it Understood. And you know what? Pete Perfides is right, because it perfectly, Understood perfectly gets it. It perfectly gets it. And also the theme of the record. I've got an album by Elvis Costello and Burt Bacharach. They collaborated on an album.
Yes, I went to see them live when they released that album. They had 3 nights in London, or 4, and I went down to see it because I thought that album was stunning.
Yeah, and the reason I bring up that Burt Bacharach Elvis Costello album is because they sat down when they were writing that album and said, we need a team, we'll have a heartbreak team. There's a song on it called Toledo, right, which is brilliant.
Yes.
They said, we need a theme on this album, we need a theme. And so they decided to have a breakup theme on all the songs. I didn't sit down to have a theme on Understand. This was what I was feeling. I was writing these songs genuinely because I was just trying to make sense of it. And I was just hurt and missing somebody and just wanting somehow to have some kind of last long conversation. And so I wrote that album. And, in fairness, breaking up with people is very difficult, and I've broken up with people, and I've been the person breaking up with people, and it's a very difficult thing to do. It's just kind of messy. And I think, because I didn't see the person for 6 years or something like that after it, there was no communication at all. I think I just wrote to them via the album. I wrote about their family and their house, and I wrote to tell them how I was doing, and I wrote to say, listen, I'm over here at the moment. If I'd sent letter. Those are the letters I would have sent. I would have said, I'm near the Hoover factory. I would have been singing these songs. So that's what kind of Understand is about. But people get so much more out of it. You know, they read their own lives into it. I don't really like, this is maybe the first time I've ever spoken about the songs, David, but I don't really like to give them too much detail because that gets in the way of what people hear, you know,
Yes.
record. But, you know, there's something about I have a particular accent and, Irish accent. And I remember when I worked in the BBC, they loved hearing my accent on the phone. The girls who worked in a different department, they loved hearing my voice on the phone. So I think there's a way I sing Boyfriend and a way I sing on different tracks that that people like. And I just mentioned another song. The last song on Understand is called Time Stood Still. And when I broke up with my girlfriend in Ireland, she went off to college. She was very bright, and she went to university. And I got a job in an ad agency, and I used to get on a bus down on College Green to get up to the ad agency on Leeson Park, and the bus went past her college, and I would always be on the bus looking out the window, wondering if I would see her by chance. And it's every day I used to get that bus because it was the bus I had to get to go to work, and I would just look off the top of the bus. And that's what that song is about, Time Stood Still, which is gets the same bus every day that goes up and turns that way to see her face. That's what that song's about. And it's the last song on the album, and it just has I remember I remember Claire and Matt really liking that song in Sarah, that they just loved that how raw the whole thing was, you know.
Yeah, it's amazing. So when the release comes out, it will be available worldwide then.
Yeah.
So because obviously Japan, because I think Sarah Records was quite popular in Japan, wasn't it? That sort of melancholic vibe. So I would imagine.
I think France is really big for Brian because I've met a lot of I've got French articles, and a lot of the people when I did get online and I got onto social media, a lot of the people who contacted me were in France, and the album came out. There's a Brian compilation issued by Virgin France. Virgin Records issued a Brian record in France, so it must have done okay. And I get a lot. I think whatever the appeal was of Understand, and I think people liked it in France. They really liked it. The Buzzcocks being an influence as well, David. I have to say, not only. I was listening to a lot of music, the Jam, when I was young, and then a friend had a Buzzcocks song called "You Say You Don't Love Me," and it's not a successful Buzzcocks song at all. It was a single that kind of flopped for them, but it was. I remember putting it on, and I just absolutely loved it. Do you know that song "You Say You Don't Love Me" by the Buzzcocks?
I don't think I do actually. I should.
Okay.
What year did that come out?
About 1979, and it's kind of at the end of their run of singles, and it's the saddest, most uplifting, beautiful song. And the vibe really is, there was a journalist friend of mine in Ireland called George Byrne, a very dear friend, a very alpha male Irish music writer, but he just absolutely loved. He was very romantic as well, behind the exterior. And he just used to talk about that kind of moment of sadness in Brian's songs. And there's a lot of it in things like Boyfriend and Knowing. There's a kind of a resignation going on.
Yes.
And that's in a lot of those Brian songs. It's certainly in Knowing, and it's in Boyfriend, and it's in Understand. And I think a lot of that comes from the Buzzcocks. And I was very influenced by, there are Buzzcocks guitar solos that are done on kind of one string. And when I was doing Understand, I realized it would have sounded really crap, the song Understand, if I started playing a guitar solo. So there's a lot of kind of, if you look at the Instagram account, I have an Instagram account, and I've done some of the songs on my Rickenbacker on the Instagram account. You can see how basic it is. The mandolins, it's just really like you're just basically putting an effect, but it is, the basis of that would be those sort of one string solos that the Buzzcocks kind of did, like 4 notes or something like that, but you put a kind of a sheen on it. So that's kind of quite beautiful. And there was a lot of mandolins. There was a band called Fantastic Something knocking around. I think they were called Fantastic Something. And there's a lot of mandolins floating around and indie music around them. and I was influenced by that. So that's why there's mandolins on it. But again, I just had the songs and I had the story, and I just wanted to, like, I think the reason a lot of people like the Brian records is I think it has a very idealized, if you look at like A Million Miles, turning up at your girlfriend's house and just, it's a very idealized romantic view of a relationship, how people want the relationship to be, that that's the, I love a big influence on me is the American writer Carson McCullers. She wrote she wrote my favorite book, which is The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. Carson McCullers said that all her books were about people maybe that fell in love with the wrong people and, ended up giving their love to the wrong people. I'm not saying that's like I'm not saying that's me or anything, but I'm saying there's a kind of a sadness, and I think there's a very I just, when I wrote about romance and first dates, and God, first date sounds kind of corny now, and you say it, but the early days of romances and being romantic and just finding that sort of connection with another person. I love Kirsty MacColl's "They Don't Know About Us" as well.
Oh yes, yeah.
That's in that that's in that Brian song, which is about getting it's the last song on Bring Trouble. It's about getting lost, with my girlfriend and my wife on our way home. This road is wrong. I think we're lost. It's just about that kind of how you connect with someone else, and you just have this amazing experience. And I think that a lot of the reason why people like Brian, the band Brian, and the Understand album is it has that very romantic view on relationships and what relationships can be, and people want that. They want to experience it, and they wonder why they haven't felt it, or they haven't experienced that. This is the kind of relationship you want and stuff like that. So I think that's why people like Understand as well, because there must be certain elements that connect with people, and there's a lot of people with carrying around a lot of sadness, and it's not a male thing. There's a lot of women who like Understand as well, and I love that, and I love that it could connect with people. And most important, I got a lot of support from listening to other people's music when I was young, and it was lovely to be able to pay it back and to do a record that people could connect with in the same way as I connected to other people's records.
Yes. Well, it's interesting. I think there was a quote from Jerry Lee Lewis who said, was it 95% of the people end up with a partner, but that's what makes the turntable spin. So you never know.
I love that. Yeah.
So, and I remember that time, actually, there's one song that I remember sort of being quite, well, there was a couple of, there was a band, Huskadoo, who always had a lot of heartfelt songs, but Elvis Costello, you mentioned him, but he did a song on Blood and Chocolate called I Want You, which is a 6-minute grinding number, which is so brutally honest and painful. It's you have to sit in a dark room for at least 2 hours afterwards, coping with his honesty. So yes, I think the 80s did sort of encourage a certain amount of sort of open introspection.
I think there's so much. I was lucky that I kind of had a rebellious teenage years where I was into the jam, but I really wasn't, turned on to a lot of stuff. And I made friends. I was a mod, and I was very lucky that the mods that I knew, and the mod thing was really interesting in Dublin because kids of all sorts of different classes met each other. Kids from very rough areas met kids from very posh areas because there were mods. And I met a lot of the mods, and I met their friends. And then I met I grew up in one part of Dublin, but I met people from other parts of Dublin, and I met people like Niall Austin, who was in Brian with me, and they and other friends of mine turned me on to books and authors, and I read a lot of Raymond Carver. I love Sam Shepard. I love the Wexford playwright Billy Roach. What I do now is, as well as the documentaries I make, I write plays, and I wrote a play a couple of years ago, which was the runner-up in the RTE Radio Drama Awards, called Wogan's Sweet 16. And I was writing a piece about Terry Wogan, and I found out that Terry Wogan was playing Irish records on the BBC during the IRA bombing campaign. And the BBC didn't like him doing that. They thought that playing Irish records on the BBC when the IRA were letting off bombs would upset people in Britain. So there was a bit of a tussle going on, but he kept playing this song called Sweet 16 by the Fury Brothers, which is an amazing song. And I wrote a radio play about that, and the Wogan family, Terry Wogan's family, really liked it, and it was a big hit on Irish radio. In fact, it's on my link tree, but if you want to Google Wogan,
yes, I did see that.
Yeah, Wogan Sweet 16 by Ken Sweeney. You can have a listen to that, and and it has music in it because you hear that amazing mandolin in Sweet 16. So I'm working on that's kind of what I do now. I was just doing a playwriting course with the Wexford playwright Billy Roach, who I love, and I'm writing drama and plays, and it's a long old slog, but you just keep going at them. Like anything, and David, you keep going at them, and you'll get there eventually, and I know I'll get there. But I would say this. It's a very sad album to stand, but I've had a ball, David.
Well, absolutely.
I've been in a job for 25 years that I've absolutely loved, and I've gotten to meet people like Ray Davis, like Paul Weller, like REM, and I've been in Athens, Georgia, and I've hung out. I love the Blue Nile. I've got to hang out with them in Glasgow. I love Glasgow. It's one of my favourite places, and so I've got to do all these things and that came from the fact that Brian, the band, didn't sell many records, but a lot of journalists liked Brian, and a lot of those journalists were very kind, and they helped me to get into newspapers. Dave Kenny and Ian O'Doherty and Eugene Masters and names you won't know, but they helped me get into the business, and I've had a great run, and I love doing it. And I live in a coastal town kind of north of Dublin, and literally I've got a job where I can just get up in the morning and I can have a thought, and if you're a kind of an entertainment writer like me, you've got a lot of contacts to rely on. And I literally wake up in the morning and I have a thought at about 8 o'clock in the morning, and I ring someone up and I'm writing that story, and the next day it's appearing in a paper. And newspapers is the other big love of my life, and I've loved being in that business, and I like where I write. And there's an author I love called Niall Williams. And I read an interview with him in the Sunday Times, and Niall Williams, the author, said, "I just want to keep on writing in this house and live peacefully in a beautiful place." And that's what I want in life.
Yes. And then obviously, are you going to have a launch party for this album, by the way?
I'd love to reconnect, but I don't know. I mean, it's just me, and I'm I don't really want to ram it down people's throats. The battle's already lost, David, as regards Brian. I mean, I loved making the records, but it's really in the hands of the label. I'd love them to put out if they put out another Brian record, I probably would reissue another Brian record. I might go out and play gigs and do some of that stuff because I could enjoy it now. I wouldn't be worried about how it would go, but I did have when the second album came out, some wonderful people, Brian and Ivor, who were the guitar player and the bass player in the Divine Comedy, they came out and they played gigs with me. And Don Ryan from the Revenants, he was the keyboard player. He came out and played with me. And we were supporting Robert Foster and Grant McClellan in Vicar Street. We were supporting them, and Brian and Ivor met Don Ryan just before they went on stage, and they said, "Oh, you're the keyboard player, eh? We're the bass and guitar." And they never rehearsed together. They just walked on stage behind me, and they all played together, and they just had such a ball. So there have been supportive people over the years who've played with me, and I'm sure I'd probably find them again. But I mean, I think as well, David, everybody's got a time to be doing music, and I don't want to be, some of my neighbours here, my friends, their son is an 18-year-old guy in a band. He was at Morrissey the other night. He plays indie music. I don't want him, I don't want to be grabbing a gig that he could be getting. I think
yes.
I'm very much aware that that there's a whole new generation of people out there. They've got their understand. They've got their music to get out of their system and to do. And I don't want to be dragging people back. The second album, the first album, I mean, when Understand came out, Keith Cullen was amazing, and he had me out playing support slots with a 12-string guitar in like the Forum and places on my own on stage, playing these songs to, hundreds and hundreds of people. I don't know where I got that from or how I did it, but I did it. The second album, Bring Trouble, which is 1999, that was written much more to play live, and we played a lot of gigs. We could play those songs live, and they sounded great live, and the band could get behind them. I suppose with the songs on Understand, I love Stina Nordenstam. There's an amazing Swedish singer called Stina Nordenstam. And
yes.
Her album, Then She Closed Her Eyes, and she never really played live, but it was all about the moments on her album. Like there were such beautiful moments. And it's hard if you're playing Understand and you're trying to recreate the, moment on the boyfriend thing. Maybe you leave me wasn't a bad thing, and you're trying to create that in like the Forum or something with 300 people who are drinking beer. It just doesn't always happen in the same way. It's something, it's like the kind of moments you're trying to create. It's kind of impossible to create that kind of thing. So a lot of the Brian moments are on those records, and I'm singing it, and I'm singing it for real. And maybe they'll come up with some sort of like a tuner device about how genuine people are, how sad they are, how much they're feeling. Because if they ever invent a machine like that, and they put the needle up against a Brian record, they'll certainly be able to feel what I'm singing and how much I felt it at the time. And it's just missing people. It's just missing someone. It's just longing, and it's done for the very best reasons. It's just done to say, I miss you. I wish I could talk to you. I wish I just miss you. And that's kind of, and it's a lot of Irish people to go to London, and my parents are kind of passed away now a long time, but I remember I sent my mother, who was always a big supporter of mine, I sent her back the You Don't Want a Boyfriend single. I sent it back to Ireland for her to play. And I didn't warn her, I didn't tell her what it was about or anything like that. So she was in my house on the Navan Road where I'm from, and she put this song on, and it just really impacted her, because I suppose she knew the girlfriend I was singing about. She knew, I'm her son. She loves me. She knew what I was singing about. She knew why I was. She knew like how sad I was about it, and it just, she just was in tears, and it was just a moment. But a couple of months later, Gay Byrne, who was a very, very big, like a Terry Wogan in Ireland, he played my music on his radio show on RTÉ Radio 1, and she heard my music at the washing line, and she couldn't believe it. So, she was always a big supporter of mine growing up, as was my dad. So they did get to see, that this gentleness I had, that it did, I'm sure David, that if you're a gentle soul and you're sensitive, life when you're young can be very tough. And they did get to see, they did get to see a lot of things come right for me. She didn't see my play on, but I always get the feeling that my parents are around, and that they would be enjoyed. They loved my music, my parents, and they're dead a few years now, but they would have loved the whole Needle Mythology reissue, and I'm sure they're enjoying it somewhere.
God, that is such a beautiful thought, actually. Yeah, well, I do, actually, I must admit, there's one thing I've really enjoyed doing this show is that a lot of, I probably mentioned at the beginning, that a lot of the stuff that happened decades ago that, just happened, and you just go, right, must get on with life. And then it's sort of people have gone back, and it's not about rose-tinted sunglasses or sort of making out the past was better, but just kind of appreciating. I think and I said, about the depth that people went to make this art and music is quite a lot. You know, it's more than me being a consumer during that period. You just thought, oh, that's a nice thing to do. But now I realise the energy, effort, and focus people had, and what they put into those songs, made me think, no wonder now that 40 years later we can listen to them and realise there is a lot there. But because as you know, the narrative of the 60s or the 70s or the 80s gets told by one group of people who are often the mainstream media. But then when people talked about the 80s and they would go, oh, it's all about the Falklands and Thatcher and the Blitz kids and Duran Duran and Live Aid, certain people like Dylan Jones would tell that. And I think, well, that's not my 80s at all. This is my 80s over here, And I think over the last few years that's those stories are being told a lot more now. And then I did an interview with a guy who's written and directed this play that's going to be in Leeds in the end of August, early September, using the music of The Wedding Present. I thought, wow, that's just amazing, isn't it? The Wedding Present is going to have a play that's going to be.
Something I'd love to. There's something I just love to say. Something I just love to say to you, David, is this: that I there were one or two reviews, I got maybe when I was doing Brian, dismissive kind of reviews. I mean, they weren't bad reviews, but they weren't, they threw me a lot. And I was very sensitive at the time after Understand came out. And years later, I became a journalist and I realized, it's really important if there's somebody listening to this who's a musician or an artist or a writer or anyone like that, you've got to just speak. You've got to just stick at it and realize that sometimes journalists are just talking absolute rubbish, that they're just trying to be funny. They'll throw lines in. I remember, we used to read The NME. I think the first Brian single came out and was reviewed in Sounds, and I think Keith Cameron called it Winsome, Winsome, Winsome. And we ran around, me and Niall, with dictionaries trying to find out what this meant. It actually means winning ways. It's quite a positive thing to say. But getting back to what I'm trying to emphasize here is a lot of times journalists say stuff in the press and they say it for a laugh. They don't think about it at all, but it can have quite profound impacts on artistic people who are doing their thing. They can read too much into it when the journalist is just trying to say something funny. They're trying to be funny. They're not thinking about your record. They're not quite taking it in or listening to it. And I'd just encourage people to just kind of keep going and keep writing songs. That's really an important thing to do. And towards the end of the 90s, you have this horrific period in the NME where they started putting comedians on the cover, and there was things like, never mind the Buzzcocks would have on musicians, like the most talented, gifted, God-given talents, and they'd put them in an identity parade, and who, they'd make gags about them and say, is it number one or is it number... These tacky comedians with no talent would be sending up these gifted frontmen or singer, musicians, artists in an identity parade. And I think that's just the pits,
Yes.
I think putting comedians on the cover of the NME was the end of the NME. And maybe some of these journalists wanted to end up writing comedy. I don't know what it was, but I just thought it was the pits. And I'm all for it. I'm all for musicians, but I don't think Badil and whoever it is, these comedians, I don't think they belonged there at all. And I think the music is quite a special thing, and I'm honored to have played music. And music, a song can come in a window and you can hear it, and it's you can't trap it down. It goes anywhere. As Edwin Collins said, about Never Met a Girl Like You. He said, it was a hit, and it didn't matter if you buried it underneath the Empire State Building. A Girl Like You was going to be a hit no matter what,
Yes, this is true. Well, look, Ken, thank you ever so much for your time for this. This has been amazing and incredible to hear the depth and the story behind so many of those tracks on the album. And yes, I will be very curious to, dig deep and listen to some of the other songs that you've just mentioned here, actually, which is fascinating.
Will you edit it down, David, or how do you do it? Or
Well, yeah, I sort of mostly, I send most of it together, but I do sometimes edit little bits and pieces out. And
well, if you, I probably went too far saying about comedians on the cover of the NME. I'll leave that
no, I
there.
don't think that was a point. No, I think the 90s started slightly okay, but then the loaded generation came into
Yeah,
our
that was it.
lives.
See, it was all Oasis and like Oasis coming along in like the mid 90s and the lad culture and loaded. And it just, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I understand wasn't going to go anywhere because that whole thing took over and that wasn't something, like,
Like, I think the 90s finishes so well because I don't know if you've seen the film on Woodstock 99, but if you
yeah,
haven't seen it,
yeah,
it kind of sums up a lot of that. Yeah, I think that's not a good. It kind of needs to come to an end, doesn't it? And it says, right, that's it, and Loaded implodes, and it's like, yeah, I think it's time for it all to go in the landfill, really.
yeah, it does, it does. But listen, that music's out there, and you know, I do admire Matt and Claire what they did with Sarah Records, and when you look back on it now, it's outrageous that something that using a girl's name and doing that could have attracted such hostility from people, and they're very forgiving, and they deserve to be lauded and for documentaries and books. And I think the NME said recently that Sarah Records was the second most important indie record label ever, and I totally go along with that.
And also, just top tip, because I think it's coming out this month as well. But I don't know if you come across the poet Brian Bilston, but he's done an album with the Catenary Wires, which is Amelia Fletcher from Heavenly and Tallulah Gosh and Rob Percy and a few others. And they've done an album together. And I think you will love it, by the way, because lyrically and poet-wise, I think you'll really enjoy it. So I'll just give you the top tip of checking that out when you get a chance. I think it's coming out this month. So there you go.
That's what we need. Another Brian mention, another act with Brian in the name, and that's like it was almost. I just threw it up because it was like the Smiths or something. It was just the most plainest name going, but it's made it really difficult, to find Brian music or my own music. So it's probably not a good idea, but probably part of the sabotaging my own career was to come up with that name. But listen, after a while, the name doesn't mean anything. Echo and the Bunnymen's a ridiculous name. People know the music, though.
Yes, I think if you say it enough, it then becomes kind of course, that's the Smiths, of course, or the Beatles, of course, that's a good idea. But I'm sure there was other ones that people go, oh God, you sure about this, mate? But anyway, it could be. Look, I better let you go, but thank you for your time. This has been amazing. And yes, good luck. And
Okay.
here's to, well, at least we've got a bit of a bright spot in 2025. Let's face it, we all need something, don't we? So yeehaw for your release. Anyway, take care. And thanks again for your time, Ken.
For a wonderful chat. Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye. Bye. And just like that, Ken has gone. But anyway, a massive thank you to Ken Sweeney for giving me the time for that interview. And yes, I will put a link in the notes below about the album that is coming out on Needle Mythology Records, Understand. This has been the C86 Show, David Eastaugh. So if you want to contact me, you can on all those social media platform sites. And all these interviews are available on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. It's true. Have a great week. Stay safe.